Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for joining us tonight on yet another session with Facebook live session with South Ilahi speakers and scholars. Tonight we have a very interesting topic. It's called The History and Theory of Architectural Islam, the Body, Image and Spirit of Place. We have two very interesting guests tonight. We have Dr. Faris and Dr. Faris Hajamaideen and also Faizan Shah. Right? But before we even dive into the dars or the lecture, we'll just remind everyone that at the end of the lecture, we do have a question and answer segment. So if you have any questions, you can just send it to +65 8776 7706. That's +65 8776 7706 for question and answer segment at the end. Bismillah. Right, Dr. Faris Hajamaideen is Director of the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Singapore Polytechnic, where he has been teaching history and theory of ideas since 2002. He completed his master's degree at McGill University School of Architecture and his PhD at the University of Adelaide's Centre for Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture. His main research interest has been the study of the human body as a site for architectural imaginings, with a special focus on the relationship between Vitruvius's De Architectura and Platonic philosophy. Recently, he has studied the relationship of body and building in the works of the 12th century Muslim illuminationist Ishraqi Shihab al-Din al-Surawardi. He has written, taught, and presented invited talks on this topic. And our second guest for tonight is Faizan Shah. Faizan Shah is a lecturer and year coordinator at Singapore Polytechnic's Diploma in Interior Design, leading the Generative Design Atelier and teaching history and theory of ideas in across 3 years in the course. Completed his bachelor's in architectural design at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, Australia, and Master of Architecture at Universität Innsbruck in Austria. He developed interest in the complexities of engaging architecture with focus on the poetical and representational through theory and the instruments of perception. Without further ado, we'd like to invite our two guests to begin their class. Bismillah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi barik wa sallim. First of all, thank you for having me. I'll start the sharing of the screen and perhaps start my presentation at the same time. Whoever is joining in, I don't know where you are, how you're seeing this. It's in Facebook. I have no idea. But thanks for joining us on a Wednesday evening on an interesting topic of architecture. And I think if you're joining in, you would have some interest in architecture, some interest in culture, or interest in the Islamic intellectual tradition, right? For me, this is quite a remarkable moment. One of teachers' great pride is to see how their students develop. And today I have with me my student, Faizan Shah. And over the next 4 weeks, we are going to share our researches, our thinking, and we're still students of this topic. And also along the way, learn ourselves too from the Q&A, because this is a topic which is very rich. Aspects of Islamic architectural theories and histories have not been quite expanded. And I like to hope there are people listening in who are currently doing better researches, good researchers, or embarking on researches. So today's session, I've titled it just Opening Remarks or Setting the Scene. And it's going to be part 1, and it's going to be a 4-parter. And I thought the idea is to perhaps open up this notion of architectural in Islam. And I've subtexted as speculations on fundamental theories that shape Islamic spaces. So when we first had a conversation on how to develop this lecture series, Faizan and myself, and I think perhaps he was the one who mooted this, we want to move away from the material studying of Islamic architecture through material artifacts or material evidences. I think this has been well clarified, and there are books out there talking about the history of buildings, history of Islamic artifacts. This includes Prophet ﷺ's artifacts which he have left behind as well, calligraphy, this all has been very well studied. But the notion of the architecture in Islam goes beyond the material into the ideas and how ideas precedes architectural form and what these ideas may have been. And I'll soon share with you why I've called it speculations, because there is an absence in the Islamic tradition on theories that underpin art and architecture. There is some literature with regards to calligraphy, but there is a good level of silence with regards with how Muslim artists, architects, and craftsmen pursued their trade over time. I'm taking this approach of 3 probes in today's lecture. I'll first take us through the notion of the other traditions that stand outside or adjacent to the Islamic intellectual culture, and open up vistas and avenues within the Islamic and philosophical and mystical sources. And last but not least, leave perhaps today's session poised for the next session, talking about how we can contemplate on a body spatial construct in prayer. And perhaps that may have something to teach us about how the Islamic tradition wants us to view architectural form and space. I'll start with the other tradition. Interestingly, unlike many other traditions, or the traditions that Islam grew side by side with, especially the Western Christian tradition and the Greek tradition and the Romans and even the Persians, there seemed to be really no text to speak about how architecture is to be pursued in Islam. And this being the case, it leaves researchers in a bit of a quandary to perhaps explain how anything was built the way it was built. This being the case, it may be good perhaps in the next few slides for me to share with you what other tradition may have had to say about how to approach architecture. And even within this tradition, I would like to share with you that Islam was in fact discussed. And that's really quite surprising on how Islam was valued as an intellectual tradition in the span of history and pre-modern history in that. I want to start with the Renaissance, and this is in the Western tradition, because there was a real efflorescence in especially Italy, right? With many factors, and we don't have time to get into it. A real kind of investment, not towards to grow the intellectual tradition in Rome at the time, to look at other cultures, and there were great patronage towards arts and architecture. And for about 200 years, starting from the early or mid of the 15th century all the way to the middle of the 17th century, there were many writers, in the Renaissance period, who expounded much about the worthiness of architecture, how to build it, how to pursue it. It's really fascinating. And one thing they did was to write architectural treatises. And this continues to be absent, or was absent at the time, in the Islamic tradition. There is no historical evidence or any kind of remnant right now of there was such writings where someone pursued to tell their audience this is how architecture should be pursued. But it's really interesting that in some of the important works written during the period of the Renaissance, the Islamic tradition or the Islamic intellectual culture has been discussed, right? Here I have an image from the second most important text written during the Renaissance on architecture. It's a Trattato di Architettura written by the architect Filarete. It's a meandering text, and then he posits a cathedral image, right, in this treatise, and then he uses minarets, right? And it's very interesting because this was never really part of the Venetian culture or in culture in Milan or in Florence. And historians have found out that this is something he perhaps was copying from the Islamic East, and namely Constantinople, modern day Turkey, right? So we must understand, in the middle of the 15th century, at the height of the Ottoman Empire, the way the Westerners were looking at the Islamic tradition was with a level of respect. And here, although he does not acknowledge this explicitly, there is an idea that a particular type of architecture is coming up, and it was okay for us to appropriate it. So interestingly, while Islam lacked that the architectural treatise writing tradition, we find elements of Islamic architectural approach being cited in the Western tradition. So I just want to bring this across as I'm setting out the scene as well. Um, Very interestingly, this was also the period where in the West, um, a renewed urgency was felt to seek out its own tradition or its own legacies, especially the lost text of Greece, right? The philosophical traditions of Plato and Aristotle. And many of you who are listening it would know that these great works that were somewhat blacked out from the Western tradition from the year 600 onwards was actually safeguarded and translated in the Islamic lens. And so in this period of the Renaissance in the Christian West, there was a great undertaking to recover Arabic texts from the East and then have them translated. What I'm pointing to is there's some level of cross transmission that is occurring here. Much study has been done on this with regards to philosophy. I don't think much attention has been paid to perhaps the architectural tradition. The next text is not really well known. This is the Hypnoroto Machia Polyphily. Um, it is a poetical work on architecture. It's filled with lovely woodcuts. It's written slightly later to the previous text I was discussing. And in this one image, which I'm showing here, is really interesting, where the main protagonist has to select one of the doors, right, of wisdom to make a choice of, what future fate holds for him. And the key portal, there are 4 key languages that has been inscribed into the stone. So we have Latin, Greek, Hebrew. For one reason or another, perhaps it's bad orthography of the of the author. The text in Arabic is really enlarged, right? And then it speaks about celebrating these languages because they hold within it wisdom of antiquity, because the knowledge is always transmitted through language. And identifying antique wisdom or knowledge here, acknowledging it, with the use of Arabic is really quite remarkable, right? Although, as you could read from the subtitle there, or the caption there, that there is wrong ordering. Nevertheless, what we need to appreciate here is Arabic has folded into the quadrant of the most important languages that is going to influence Renaissance intellect. May he be an artist, an architect, or even a philosopher, right? So Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Arabic. And on the left, I've written Arabic and Islam towards Hermetic wisdom. Certain thinkers felt that in the Islamic lands, they had a tradition of alchemy, and to manipulate material, one perhaps have to get and translate this text to better understand deep wisdom, deep spiritual knowledges as well. I'll keep moving on. So that set a stage of the absence in the Islamic tradition. Also the appreciation in other traditions of where Islam stood with regards to philosophical, intellectual knowledge. But then when we turn back into our own tradition, it's really interesting then, how did we manage to build remarkable buildings, especially mosques, dating back to, to the 8th century, right? This is the Umayyad Mosque. How were these works guided? How were they built? Right? It's really remarkable, right, to think through this. And then if we move on to find out some of the ongoing traditions in especially the architecture of the mosques, for example, also allows us to really consider where do these forms come from. And again, this lecture does not give me time to really elaborate on this. But for example, even if we take the notion of the minaret, historians are struggling to understand how did the minaret tradition come about and became so aligned or part of the Islamic mosque tradition. So here Oleg Grabar, so for those taking notes, is O-L-E-G Grabar, G-R-A-B-A-R. He believes that the minaret evolved from a Roman lighthouse, right? For example, and then you can see between the lighthouse, which is A, moving on to one of the earliest version of the minarets from Cairo, and more of the recent minaret forms. We don't know, so we are only speculating, right? The other is the repeated floor plan or the spatial planning of mosques. Um, the quadrature, which is naturally the square form that dominates or used to dominate many of the traditional mosque types, right? And the open courtyard. And a direct link this has with the original design of the Prophet's Mosque, which depending on the accounts, which could be 100 cubits by 100 cubits or 70 by 70, but it is remarkably positioned or designed to be a square. And only the front portion where the colonnade is, where the original column was or the roof covering was, is covered. The rest of the space becomes an open courtyard. And then this dimensionality, this form has continued on. And again, there is no real clarity how this was decided. And we cannot second guess it because this form, especially of the Prophet's Mosque, right, was designed by Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself. So again, the notion of the Prophet being an architect now is a very provocative and very exciting, project to consider too. So if you think about it, how would any of these forms would have derived from? Several theories. One is a natural continuity. You must know that Islam spread from one part of the earth to the other part, and Muslim craftsmen were generally very adaptive. So mosques in China from the 10th century look very Chinese in that sense, and they're perhaps just adapting to the customs of the lands they were in. That could be one idea, and that's borne by evidence as well. The other is the traditional guild practices, where what the knowledge within the guild amongst the craftsmen is somewhat held in secrecy, or because they are the professionals, they did not feel the need to share it, right? So it's not a real disadvantage that in Islam there is no architecture theory that is orally transmitted or it's transmitted, publicized. Perhaps that's how this culture's tradition has always been. And this is not new because in the medieval tradition in the Christian West as well, there is no real record on how these great cathedrals were built. The other way of thinking about it is no one really felt an importance of writing down this as a theory because the knowledge is passed from one person, from one craftsman to his son or his apprentice, and this was just carried on and on and on. So that perhaps the knowledge was circulating in the community, was perhaps felt by those who master masons and those who built this structure, that there was no real necessity for it to be recorded or written down. But there is a document that exists and it emerges somewhat in the 16th century. And this is with the most remarkable Islamic architect, I would say has ever existed, Mimar Sinan in the Ottoman Empire. And there's now a real consciousness of an architect wanting to record his thoughts. And again, for those of you who are interested, There's only one real text where we read Sinan's own writing. Sinan actually writes his autobiography, and in that he celebrates, or he tracks his journey on how he became an architect. And he quite lovingly described how he actually designed and had his wonderful mosques realized. Um, for those interested in research, this work by Seleme Mosque, uh, titled A Study of Ottoman Narratives on Architecture, would be a remarkable reference. She really delved deep into Sinan's work, and with her grasp of Turkic language was able to also unpack details that really showed the sophistication of an Islamic architect at the height of the Islamic history, right? Grasping and dealing with architectural ideas. It's a unique text. It's her PhD that was converted, and for those of you, who are interested in research, I would direct you to Selene Mosque, or even write to her. She's teaching in Adelaide University right now. What I want to get into is how Sinan goes about then describing his architecture. Because I've been talking about there's been an absence in theory. So here we start to peek into how an Islamic architect want to think about the building, because we're looking at the theories behind how buildings could have been shaped. One thing that is really coming through with Sinan is the architect now sees himself as an intellect and an important contributor, or as an important figure who is now identified uh, within a political system, right? He is not just a builder. He now comes conspicuous, right? In the tradition that I am the architect and I am contributing, uh, you know, um, to the city, right? So his role now becomes recognized. Um, and then he writes in his autobiography, right? And there are like, I think, 5 versions of it. And here specifically, he talks about giving thanks first. And interestingly, he starts to connect the activity of God into building the heavens, and then building the body of Adam, and then somehow or other that having a connection to how we should think about architecture. And this is so poetically written, right? And doing him injustice, because I'm going to just read it out here. Thanks and praise to that creator of the foundation of the 7 stories. So immediately it evokes an idea of building here, and incomparable glory to the builder of the heavenly canopy of 9 volts. So if there is a paradigmatic and original architect, it has to be God, right? Who in this workshop of water and earth, without even a recourse to a ruler, a level, right? A ruler or a compass, was able to fashion the private palace of Adam's body. This is worth a pause, right? He is now allowing us to envision the human body as though it is a building. And just realize how he's building this. He starts speaking about the heavenly canopy that is built by God, which is architectural. And then the body of Adam also described architecturally. So there is some level of parallel or resonance between the cosmos and the Adamic body, right? Which he says is the pavilion of the heart and the soul. So the human body is an architecture that was specifically built for uh, the body, the makeup of the body and the soul. And then he goes on to just flourish it, right? And render delightful the mosque of the hearts of the humankind with adornment of virtue. Uh, so I think I've kind of like covered the key factors that needs to be connected here, and I'll unpack it in the next few slides. Um, just on a side note, I have put here the Seleme Mosque. In another part of his text, Sinan actually describes the mosque and the minaret in a very interesting way. Um, he identifies the dome with the prophet. Um, and you must know that the dome is a over-encompassing structure that was miraculously floated on top of a building. You must understand it's a really difficult venture for an architect in the 15th or the 16th century to put up. And in a way, the dome, it's the human, how do I put it right? is the human attempt to recreate the cosmos. So it's remarkable. And then because it's so remarkable, he says, the analogy of this is the prophet, right? And then the four minarets, he names them after the four rightly guided caliphs. I just thought that would be an interesting side note, so it's stated here. And then when we look at what he has stated in the paragraph I've just described, few things actually comes true to us. Uh, One is the understanding of God, right? As the omnipotent and the greatest architect, right? And then the connection of God's activity in, you know, structuring and designing this amazing cosmos, and the relationship that cosmos has with the human body. It seems like there's a continuity between God's creative activity of the cosmos and its connection to the human body. And uh, all this is kind of like can be refound in building architecture. It's almost like the architect can understand this relationship by building himself, by designing himself. So this is worth thinking about what architecture really means, right? And that kind of like brings to the crux of what Zan and myself want to cover in the next several weeks, inshallah, right? It's how architecture can be contemplated via the human body. So if we look at some pre-modern cultures, and I want to make some connections here with God, cosmos, man, and architecture, and as specifically with the idea of Adam that Sinan had spoken about. It's really interesting because I spoke about Filarete with my first slide. This is the 15th century, you know, uh, he's a Florentine or Milanese architect writing his book. He speaks about it in a very similar form too. He says, God wished that man, Adam, just as he was made in his image, should make something similar to himself. And this is a kind of a really unique way of rereading the Bible, right, by Filarete. So what Filarete is trying to say is God wished that as he was made in God's image, that man should himself make something similar to himself. So man must try to recreate, like God made man in God's image. Now man must create something in his own image, right? And in this way, man is participating in a divinely activity, a recollection or remembering or giving thanks to God, right? And he tells a story which is not found in the Bible. So he just creates this. He says, Adam was expelled from the heavens, and when he was expelled from the heavens, it was raining. So when he was coming down, and instinctively Adam put up his hand over his head like this, and magically he is trying to articulate the language of architecture. And soon enough, when Adam finds himself on earth, the very first thing he realizes he has to do on earth is to build. Just as God has built the cosmos and God has structured Adam, his body, then Adam now goes on to build architecture, which is a shelter for him, for security. And with this security, now humankind can survive and thrive. So it almost becomes a divine ordinance to build. And this tradition of looking at the body, celebrating it, understanding architecture through it, connects back all the way and to the oldest architectural text by Vitruvius, dated about 30 before the Christian era, right? 30 years prior to the Christian era. And many of us may know this popularly through this image by Da Vinci, which is the Vitruvian Man, which is found in this text. Primarily, the notion of the Vitruvius Man is architecture is the microcosm or is a mirror of the human body, which in itself is a microcosm of the cosmos. So there is a real powerful uh, uh, resonance or connection between these two realms of the cosmos of the human body and architecture. And he states here something really remarkable as a training for the architect, that one should think of how geometry is formed. He says the perfect geometries are actually formed through the studying of the body. And he says that if a pair of compass is inserted through the human navel, and please don't try this, right? And then if you circuit it around the body, it will form a perfect circle and it will fit the human body perfectly. And from these two, you can shape the square. He does not quite go on to say how it is shaped, but he's trying to situate the human body being perfectly formed by the two primordial geometries of the square and the circle. The circle, as you know, is the old description of how the cosmos operates. The square is how the cosmos is quartered to north, south, west, and east, through which mankind finds both direction and also time. So again, this is a very deep conversation to be had here. Again, I'm emphasizing the point on uh, architecture is beyond just the building. The basis of what generates architecture has a whole metaphysics behind it that's worth, it needs to be considered, right? So as I've stated here, the cosmic geometry is shared with the body, and we need to think deeply through this. Architecture is a copy of the human body, which is also the copy of the cosmos. Again, for those who are interested, the ideas of Vitruvius is actually ideas he drew from the philosophies or the numerological symbolism of Pythagoras and Plato. So these are connections that it can be made. So this is what I was talking about, that eventually what Vitruvius is trying to allude to here is the human body is a microcosm of the cosmos, and for an architect to be successful and to be blessed by the providence or divine, he has to in fact study both the cosmos and his own body. And if I may share with you some other examples, not from the Islamic tradition, from other tradition, the body has always played a powerful role in how architecture was seriously considered. And here it's from the Christian tradition, from St. Augustine's City of God. And again, this is not an architecture text. St. Augustine is perhaps the closest approximation of Al-Ghazali in the Christian tradition. He talks about how the proportion of Christ, right, was important as a saving vessel even before Christ became born as a human being. And he says that Noah's Ark was only successful because it took the proportion of Christ, which is 1:6. So the whole idea of the body giving shape to the building was in the Greek notions that's found in Pythagoras and Plato, Vitruvius, who is Roman, and here now in the Christian tradition. And more of the Eastern cultures too has always thought about the body and the building having very close relationship. And that is only possible because the way the body was understood was quite different from the biological body that we understand in modern times. On the left is from the Chinese tradition, where the celebration of the head, studying of just the features of the face, and how that this could be appreciated as a palace is really remarkable, right? And on the right, some of you know this is the Vastu Purusha Mandala, which is studied deeply of the cosmic man in this grid formation that forms the basis of many traditional Hindu buildings, especially the Hindu temple. So that was the other traditions. And while in the Islamic tradition, there may not be treatises written about architecture, something that I did, coached by my teacher, Samer Akash, whom I speak a little bit about later, is uh, there is no actual absence of thinking about architecture or thinking about architecture through the body in other sources in Islam, especially when we study philosophical or mystical sources. So I would just want to go through with you quite quickly 4 references. Again, for those of you who are interested, you can unpack it even more because the evidences are there. It just requires deeper research work for us to contribute to our own tradition. So for example, in the Ikhwan as-Safa, right, the Brethren of Purity, I believe it was in the 11th century, they wrote series of epistles or treatises on from geometry all the way to music, on metaphysics, right? Uh, we find a very curious entry that seems very similar to what we read from Vitruvius, right? So I've already spoken about what Vitruvius said about the relationship of the human body with the cosmic geometry. But then when we look at what the Ikhwan as-Safa wrote, and there's no indication they ever read Vitruvius. They write, if man raises his arm above his head and one arm of the compass is placed in his navel, and it is open to reach the tips of his fingers, and then it is rotated to touch the tips of his toes, the distance would measure 10 handspans, etc., etc. A very similar type of operation is indicated here. Where the sources come from, perhaps they meet with Pythagoras. What I'm indicating here is, whilst there may be absent in a contiguous architectural treatise in our tradition, the notion of measure, of proportion and building perhaps can be found in other texts, and it requires some level of investigation. The second example would be Al-Farabi, right? So Al-Farabi, remarkable philosopher, the second teacher after Aristotle, and that's how he was called even in the Christian West at that time. Uh, Here he is talking about how the city, the planning of the city, how it should be arranged, should be also thought of similarly of the human body, right? Both the city and the household have an analogy with the body of the human being. The body is composed of different parts of a definite number, some better and some baser, adjacent to one another in rank. If I recall, he places the heart and the liver quite high. And then he builds a whole kind of a proportion of how to think about the city, planning of the city, think as though you're thinking about the organs of your body. So um, Al-Farabi is an interesting reference. Suhrawardi, whom I spent some time, thinking and writing about, brings us really close to the idea of talking about body, soul, and architecture, albeit not really through Islamic tradition. He circuits it through the Zoroastrian tradition. He was, from Persia in that sense, right? And the Hayakil Nur, which is, which I've put a image of here, but it is here translated as the shape of light. I think a more accurate translation would be the temple of light, right? The temple of light. And the temple is talking about the human body. And here the quote comes from a far more poetical work where he again references uh, 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 what's the word I could use? An alchemical figure from an unknown past, Hermes Trismegistus, right? Of praying in this temple of light, which is an analogy of the human soul. And at some point where the veil between this world and the other world is rent, right? The entire architecture now translates into just light. And so Rawari continues to discuss uh, all his metaphysical ideas through the notions of light. Last but not least is Al-Ghazali, in the Marvels of the Heart, a remarkable text on the conditioning of the different aspects of the heart and the soul. He brings the analogy of architecture, and he speaks of the heart as almost like being a fortress, and we should really be careful of the doors and entrances and how we guard, guard that heart, which is a fortress. So again, these are just small vignettes for whoever is listening, uh, as you're contemplating about space and architecture. Islam truly has other avenues to think about them, and these are some of the sources for you perhaps to reread them if you and think about them architecturally. So I come to the last part of my conversation. I think I've run over time. Is the notion of the body spatial construct in prayer. And I think of all that I've spoken about, if you want the best advice, go to the Prophet, right? And he has a way of speaking and pointing us directions, which is quite remarkable. And in the most abbreviated sentences, he opens up dimensions that can really, put in some amazement. And he writes, "The earth has been made sacred and pure and a mosque for me." And you just got to pause and think about, so mosque could be a wide expanse, need not even be contained within a space. So whenever the time of your prayer comes, so time becomes an important element, right? For any one of you, he should pray wherever he is. Immediately, this opens up the whole notion that the body in prayer becomes a site, a building site. There's a kind of a construct that is built in the relationship. The body in its action of the prayer activates the site and becomes a mosque, right? So the body in prayer should perhaps be contemplated as a building, and it's only activated, and it can be activated at any time. So in Islamic tradition, perhaps the mosque can, in some form, if we think of it as the body, can appear and disappear whenever someone stands and pray. And this is really an evocative way of thinking about architecture. And we are so fixed about thinking about architecture as permanent structure. This allows us to really think about how architecture can be rethought about, especially with the notion of space making. So I'll conclude my session today on speaking about how the body in prayer, especially as it sets itself up, can be understood as setting up three boundaries. First of all, the body itself, when it takes its position to pray, is worth a note because it's directionally bound. So there is a real pull where the body is facing. So there is a clear axial line, or a kind of a clear geometry that we draw ourselves to this the direction of the Kaaba, right? So there's a kind of a determination of how the body is to be situated, first of all. So the face, the front of the building, the body is towards a particular dimension. And prayer times, most of the time, is generated by the path of the sun. So there is now a notion of the sun path, which has both to do with direction and also time. And architecture evolves with time. I'll just leave it as that. Architecture used to have a relationship with the shadow, which does not quite exist anymore. And all of you listening it would know that our prayer times, if you read the text, is actually calculated through the span of the shadow, right? At least in the middle prayers, right? Again, there's something really remarkable about it. But I hope that when we're standing up to pray tomorrow, you understand, there's a space that your body is already starting to form, and these shapes, even though you don't see it, is actually occurring. And last but not least is the framing zone. The body in prayer, when it stands up, it stands in relation to a boundary that is inviolable and should not be crossed. Is the sutra, which is about 1.4 meters. So there's actually a boundary that is set up in front of the body that is praying, that determines at least the beginning of the prayer. As you stand up to pray, in itself, it starts to structure space. So I've spoken for far too long. I'll pause here, but this is what would be coming up in the next lecture. As I pause here, in the next lecture, we would investigate how the body in prayer itself also starts to form geometry, the symbolism of that geometry. And the text that has been guiding our researchers was written by Samir Akash more than 10 years ago already. It's called The Cosmology and Architecture in Pre-Modern Islam. So using that as a basis and some other text, inshallah, we hope to unpack the body in prayer and the geometry it forms up in the way we think about architectural Islam. Right. I apologize for taking up too much time, and I would stop here. Thank you. I'm ready for Q&A.
Bismillah. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Faris.
Walaikum salam. Apologies, too long.
No worries. To be honest, I think there's a lot more for us to unpack.
Yes.
Yeah, really. Hi. I think we'll drag in Zan as well for
Hi.
this conversation, inshallah.
Please do.
Hi, Zan. Okay, I think there's really a lot of content. I think very interesting theories that we can actually speak about. But I think let's start on a more macro perspective. Based on what you've mentioned, Dr. Faris, why do you think, or could you explain to us why is it that the early theorists on architecture, they focused a lot on the idea of measurement of their body, human body, and its relation to the cosmos? Why was that so?
So this is not specific to the Islamic tradition, right? I mean, this is across all traditions, because there was a worthiness in the body, and namely because of the relationship of the soul with the body. So that the body is not a mechanical project. There was always a divine element that was within the body. So if I can just speak about the traditions that I know of, which is the Islamic, Judaic, and the Christian traditions, which are quite parallel. There is, even a hadith that says that Adam was made in the image of God. I mean, there's some interpretations to be done there, but it actually is an honoring of the human body, right? Or the human image. And even in the Islamic tradition, the Quran, where shaitan keeps coming up, is disobedience to bow or prostrate to the thing that God has created, which is Adam, for example, right? So, and the shaping of Adam by God, it's an honorable act. It was not an accidental act. So there is something about this original structure or the original design which was pursued by thinkers, not just architects, just by thinkers as something that needs to be studied. Because one of the most important intellectual pursuit was with mathematics, right? With geometries. And they found the geometries being quite natural, right? Because the cosmos is rotating and the only thing that can rotate is a compass, right? So they felt that if the same hand that designed the cosmos also designed man, there's something that has to be really understood deeply before man starts to create. I don't think I would have time to share this in this 4 lecture series. Even this could even be studied in the way geometry was pursued in calligraphy in Islam, for example, right? And then in both the Christian and the Islamic tradition, the use of the compass was not trivial. There was something really magical and continuous about how the compass, perhaps there was a divine compass to shape the cosmos, and it's the compass that shapes the building as well. So I guess a long answer, but I hope you can see there's so many layers that are connected that and because the cosmos is so far away, the nearest element for us to study to understand the cosmos is the body. But I will perhaps frustrate and make the female audience very angry. It was, for some reason, the Western tradition was always the male body. So I'm not going to apologize for them. So there you go. Yeah. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Doctor. How about Zan? Do you have anything to add on?
Salam. Yeah. So I think just a continuation about how important measurement is, eventually leading to geometry and the deep study of geometry in our tradition, and of course the traditions that are with what you can call the classical architectural tradition that correlates together with classical tradition in religion. It will be this close relationship of measurement or measuring the self against, like what Dr. Faris says, towards a greater being and towards a greater measure, outside our own body and our own extent. But I think the point that we are getting at to see that how even the body reacts to and supposes a geometry. It is something that is quite kind of like missing in our, but it's existent. It is there, but it sort of like coordinates or it coordinates our own relationship to ourselves and eventually relationship to the creator. So I think that is where this study it is something that we both of us have taken quite interest in, and especially myself when I think we will unpack on geometry and on that traits.
Yeah.
So,
To add on to this question on sacred geometry,
yep.
We've heard of the idea of a golden number, of how, in the cosmos or in creation, there's a certain order to it. Perhaps could you maybe comment a little bit on this idea of, is there such a sacred number or golden number, or that we've heard? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
there is a Zan, you want to take it on first?
No, I think Faris, you can start this.
I spent too many years of my life thinking about this. I do not know the accuracy of it, but there is a tradition that carries on far into history. The whole notion of the 6 foot, for example, 1:6.
Okay.
So, and Ibn Arabi actually talks about it quite similarly in the Islamic tradition. But I don't want to talk about Ibn Arabi. We need scholars to talk about him. But just to make a connection. But through Pythagoras, there has, and it comes through Plato, the numbers 1, 2, 3 seem to be significant, right? Because when you come to number 4, it can be divided. 4 is divided by 2. Well, 1, 2, 3 resist divisibility. So there's a purity to it. And 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6, right? Okay, so stay with me here. And the first 4 numbers are quite interesting because 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 adds up to 10. And 10 is seemed to be the complete number because anything between 1 to 10 makes up all the numbers that will ever exist. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is thought of both the circle because it's complete and the square because 4 sides of the square, right? So, okay, are you still with me on this, right? So 1:6 and 1:10 has always seemed to be some levels of perfect ratios, right?
Okay.
And next week, inshallah, when we continue this conversation, we would find the 4 and 6 being repeated back in our tradition. I'll just leave off with a bit of a sneak peek into next week. The most important architectural form in Islam is a cube. It's 6-sided. The basis of the cube is a square, which is 4-sided. Okay, Zan, your turn.
Yeah, I think not so much on sacred geometry, but I think that every kind of relationship to geometry is very important. If I were to just reiterate back or draw back to what was shown in the slide, is that it is only perhaps up to Sinan that we really see a model of architecture or Islamic architecture, if you can say, that we can trace back onto. And that means when we say model, it means it is a set of prototypes or iterations that we can fall back on. And before that, it was perhaps quite hard to trace or quite hard to refer to. And this is unique, and we may wonder why. I think this is just one segment of a very large unpacking, if you say, because we can talk about. I think all of us would be interested about, or the first thing we would remind ourselves of Islamic architecture are the ornaments, ornamental design and such. But I think there is one aspect that is already been quite covered quite thoroughly, and I think we are looking at the other side of things. Yeah.
I think
Sorry, I'm just showing we have 10 fingers, right?
yes,
And the
Bismillah,
things that we
Doctor.
count with is our fingers, right? So
Yes.
if I might just add on, I think the word geometry comes from the Greek word geometria, which is earth measure, and the measurement of earth and the different ways to look at it is through casting of shadows. Is one way to measure it, and it unpacks direction and time. And without the knowledge of direction and time, man is lost. I hope you can appreciate, right?
Mm.
So I think what both Zan and want to also emphasize is even the way one thought about geometry was not in abstract as what we think of now as the mathematical sciences that we do. Geometry was always interconnection of ourselves with the deeper metaphysics. So it was never
Yes,
thought
mashallah.
about in isolation, right?
Mm.
And this was not within just the Greek culture, but this was taught throughout our cultures. And again, I don't have the wherewithal to study this, but Al-Farabi also has written a book on music, because that's the other thing we didn't cover about. Numbers don't just translate in geometry, numbers translates into harmony.
Mashallah.
Yeah, and 1:6, 1:10, 2:3, etc. It could be
Wow.
recomposed as harmonics as well.
Mm.
And harmony also has different meanings to it, amongst others, things that are put into order. And the greatest shaper of order is God. So you're asking me the question, why the body, right? So if you look at it, this conversation can go on till midnight. But I hope I've given you some level of thinking about this, right? It's just remarkable in that sense. Yeah.
It is indeed, and I can sense that it's going to be a very interesting Wednesday nights over the next few days. Just for the benefit of those who just tuning in, we're going to have these sessions every Wednesday for this month of July. And yeah, just to kind of connect the dots on where we were talking about, we spoke about the body and geometry. I wanted to scope it a little bit on the idea of form and function. I guess perhaps it's probably a very common debate, perhaps even in the architectural scene. But is there an idea of something being something being focused, or rather, is there an ugliness? Is there an ugliness to a certain architecture? Because now in this day and age, we see modern buildings that might be seen as, not beautiful, and perhaps it doesn't serve a certain um function. It's just for the form. It's just for it to look beautiful, or for it to, but some people might find that certain building is not beautiful. So there's this debate on form and function. Like, should a building be beautiful, or should a building be functional? Is there a debate? And what was the conversations that the ancients knew about this, and how can we relate it back to modern context? Yeah.
Zan, you want to take this one first, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is very interesting, because it comes to there is a very modernist kind of question where form follows function, or the other way around. But one thing in particular, where the subject matter that we're talking about, architectural Islam, is that we usually, it shouldn't be seen as if it's a study of remnants. As you would have noticed, as you would have tuned in, it is a lot. It is still ongoing. It is still unraveling. Every in example, every prayer is an unraveling of space. Is a constant flux, right? So me and Dr. Faris, we kind of spoke about this recently, about the situation about right now, where the SAF in the congregational prayer has been challenged or disrupted, right? It's no longer shoulder to shoulder,
Yes.
and all of that. So that itself is a change in the perception of architecture and how it performs. You see, and if I answer that question again, it is something that I think the religion sort of like allows it to adapt it is a constant unpacking. We should not see it as a remnant of like, oh, I think we tend to fall into why can't we fall back to a Umayyad kind of architectural majesty and things like that. We see there is optics, right? But in terms of the hakikat of it, right, it is still there. The essence of it is what we're gonna get at performance. The functionality of the mosque is no longer. Will it still be functioning if you allow only 50 jama'ahs to be there and with a 1 meter spread saf, right? I think that's something that we will really talk about, because that was the slide that Dr. Faris sort of like left off tonight.
All right.
Good answers. If I may, my take on this would be a bit historical. I think it goes back to the word of beauty, right? And beauty in different languages, especially in Islam, has got a deeper root as well. Just for the conversation right now, is the word beauty in Greek is called kosmoi, which is actually cosmos. Sorry, is connected to the word order. So that which is beautiful is that which is well ordered, right? And that which is well ordered can only be well ordered because that which should be in its place is in its right place. Things are put in its right place, right? So again, we come back to the body. There's a reason why the 5 fingers are shaped this way, and the palm and the forearm and rest are all of different proportion. They are not all of the same size. So there's a kind of an order in which things are put together. So that's why I think they were always looking at proportions and what sizes certain things got to be before they shaped a building. And any of this shaping of a building part goes back to the proportions we spoke about just now, right? I spoke about 1:6 or 1:10, and there could be other proportions as well. And historically, buildings were not built for the utility of men. And that's how we think of buildings right now. The utility as, is it very comfortable? Utility as in, does it look of the right style now so it could be promoted and sold, right? It's monetized, right? The way buildings are thought about, at least the great buildings are thought about as though as a kind of a link between the earth and the cosmos. So if you talk about form and function, the function of the building was to ensure that a connection is between the heavens and the earth, right? Because the enterprise of building was precarious because it can collapse. And in the Ottoman Empire, building the dome was very scary because it can collapse. And the architect may lose more than his job. I'll leave it there, right? So I hope you understand that the way we think about form and function and how form and function was actually thought about was different. So there was not a need for the architect to be the most innovative, trying to sell his ware, etc. He was trying to harmonize between the language of the earth and the language of the cosmos, all for the reasons I've explained, because the architect is continuing somewhat the work of God and is playing with numbers that is beyond him. He's trying to make some sort of intermediary action, right? And when we come to the modern tradition, I think in modern times, I think we're struggling with this because we are unable to articulate what actually is order. And I think we also cannot confirm why a building is beautiful or not beautiful, because it's a notion of utility. What does the word function means, right? So if we negotiate that the human is more than a utilitarian body who just functions in the building to enjoy this space or move about it comfortably, and if you have to look beyond the utilitarian function of how a human is, which we are, and the building can connect to it, and perhaps that's one way we can go beyond this, usual opposition between the beautiful or the not beautiful, etc. But we have been conditioned to look at buildings as pictures and to compare, and the new fashion. So while in those days they were connecting between cosmos and human beings, we are horizontally connecting between current fashion and sensibilities. So it's a disjuncture there.
Inshallah. Thank you for that. We have a lot of interesting questions coming up. Next question is on, actually the question is on whether there's any connectedness between the different traditions of how they thought about architecture. Because you mentioned about the Vitruvian Man, you mentioned about our Islamic tradition as well. The question is basically, was there any contradiction with the traditions? Did they disagree on how architecture should be like and its connectedness with the cosmos or God? How did they agree and how did they disagree with one another? So perhaps you can see some differences. Yeah.
Yeah. Zan, I'll take this first.
Yeah.
Zan,
No.
okay. No. So it's about whether they disagreed or they agreed, right?
Yes. Was there a
fundamentally,
consensus? Yeah.
Fundamentally, in the premises I've spoken about, there was no disagreement, mainly because I don't think they knew what each other was talking about, but naturally because there was a sacred dimension existing. They were connected in that plane, even if they're not communicated to one another. So sometimes it's surprising. Between the Greek tradition, which is not the Christian tradition, but when the Christians came into power through post-Rome, they found that they could connect to the Platonic tradition. They found some synthesis with what the Bible was talking about numbers and with what was spoken by Plato, for example. They were able to make the synthesis.
Yeah.
And this saw the buildings of the great cathedrals, especially in France, in the Chartres Cathedral, etc., where there was a synthesis between Plato and the Bible, right? In the Islamic tradition, I except for the Ikhwan as-Safa, where there is definitely a Pythagorean link there, right? And they were definitely Pythagoreans. There is no evidence this was manifested in building structures, because as I mentioned in my lecture, there is no evidence of architecture theory to really point to us it was a connection. But if you look at the high points of Islamic history, we were quite comfortable in the way we wanted to interpret, say, Pythagoras, Plato, or Aristotle, right? So in that sense, yes, there was synthesis. There was ability to take something that's foreign to the tradition and synthesize it, and perhaps even speak about it Islamically, right? So that aspects exist. Whether that aspects actually led to architecture in Islam, until we get to, I believe it is the student or the one who came after Sinan, I forgot his name. Next week I'll have your name for you. The architect who came after Sinan, he references Pythagoras in his architecture writing. So that comes after, so there was synthesis later, right? But I think the simple answer is, even if they have not communicated, because of the sacred tradition and the way they saw the body in relation to the earth and the sky, right? There was some agreement in the way they approached at least building, right? Yeah.
Okay. How about you, Zan?
I think in terms of, you can see, I think my answer is a bit simplistic, but you can see through history, even the Hagia Sophia, right? The adaptation where it was, when it was Constantinople, and it was taken back again, it used to be a church and then a mosque, a kind of, because of its use of sacred geometry, we can relate to it, right? And one close example, you can see that if the studies being made about the mosque in Indonesia, the Demak Mosque, and it is closer to be looking like a pagoda than a mosque from a Turkic mosque, So again, the relationship of certain geometries, certain sacredness of space that allows us to have, like what you say, a communication of sorts, right? My answer would be simplistic. It would do, I think, a lot more good if you were to read up on this a bit more, because there's a lot of scholars who have covered this more grounds than myself.
On that note, Zan, just to add on, do you have any reading material you might want to recommend to the viewers if they want to find out more? Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot. So maybe perhaps Maybe perhaps I think in our slides I think we
All right.
slide it in,
Updated,
but
yeah.
Sure.
not off the head. Yeah.
Sure. All right. No worries. Yeah. Let's go with another question. Both of you mentioned about the idea of sacredness and architecture being, there is a form of sacredness. But I was curious, how about the idea of it being profane? Is there a dichotomy between sacredness and profanity in terms of what they actually build and what actually makes a certain architecture sacred, or what makes it profane? Is there a difference?
Definitely, you have to take that one first.
I'm not prepared for the question, so I'll be frank about this because, and I'll clarify this if possible next week too. There were degrees of what was sacred and perhaps not profane in the traditional world. And was this question asked? Was it asked from someone from the audience?
Yeah, it's
Brother?
a question that we have over here.
Okay.
Yep.
And perhaps this person was also inspired by the legendary text by Mircea Eliade with the sacred and the profane. And if I'm not wrong, the notion of the profane only kicks in later on, where we were able to separate the sacred from our lives. So, short answer is, I think in the traditional world, in the pre-modern world, there was no real consciousness of the notion of the profane. And even in the Eastern cultures, as far as I know, where they had certain traditions communicating with spirits, for example, right, in the Japanese tradition or the Chinese tradition, that is another level of spirituality. It's not necessarily the profane or the secular as we know it. This consciousness only came in later, where there is a real separation between what belongs to the world of God and what is outside of the realm of God. Yeah. So I will leave it at that, because even houses were not taken trivially, because and we still have ceremonies, when people move into the house, right, of blessing it, etc. And then this continues from some other views too, right? And it, I think, cuts across many traditions. So yeah, I just leave it at that. I must say, I think there's a proper and deeper answer to this, but I don't think in the pre-modern world there was a real consciousness of what a profane is, because God is overwhelming. Yeah. So there you go. Okay.
Thank you, Doctor. How about you, Zen?
No, I think we'll leave it at that good note.
All right. All right, inshallah. The next one, in the current 21st century, there's a lot of isms that would tend to separate things into masculine and feminine. So the idea of the male and the female, masculine and feminine. I was wondering, or the question is, whether in architecture there is that dichotomy between masculine design or feminine design, or is it seen as a unified design? Did they make such a distinction, or yeah? Bismillah.
I'm set up to answer this wrongly and get into trouble.
Hopefully not, Doctor. Hopefully not. Yeah.
Zan is more well-versed with contemporary philosophies. Maybe Zan, I'll see how you take this and see if I can spin on this. Yeah, tricky grounds. Yeah.
Yeah. No, sorry. Maybe you can go ahead, because I was shifting. I was shifting.
Okay. The notion of, you're speaking about more of the modern, right? And then whether there is a way of understanding something to do with masculinity or femininity, right? Yeah. So whoever asking these questions, if I could clarify, this is not scope of the lecture series, but nevertheless, because we're trained in architecture theory, we'll attempt to answer it. There was, I think, Zan, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of discussion about feminism and architecture. And the whole idea also came about because architecture is seen and continues to be dominated by males, right? And then the power buildings, the verticality, as though it has some analogy to male ego. So there were discussions around this, in architecture circles. I think this has disappeared. And the whole notion of the outside being male and the domestic being female also was discussed, right? But putting that aside, again, Zan, you may be well versed in this. I know in cultures say in Asian region, there are spaces within the domestic house which is dedicated to the female, for example. I think those notions does exist. Am I right?
Yeah, but I think you mean like the rumah ibu and all of that.
Yeah,
Even
yeah, yeah.
yes.
So I think that is much more richer for discussion. A specific to understanding of contemporary architecture, whether there was some rivalry between feminism and masculine power. Yes, there was obviously a discussion. If anyone wants reference for books, there's a book called Sexuality and Space, Sex in Architecture, and the third one would be called Stud, STUD, right?
It's by Elizabeth Gross mostly.
I believe, yeah. So these are some references. I don't want to explain too much because I may be misreading this, but those who want to research on this, these are 3 texts they can look into. Yeah.
Right. A more open-ended question for this one. I believe Dr. Faris, you mentioned in the DARS on the importance of rethinking architecture. Perhaps could you elaborate a little bit? Because I believe you're making reference to architecture not being permanent, that it can be fluid. It's not a permanent thing. Maybe could you elaborate a little bit more? What does it mean to rethink architecture? Yep.
I think the way we have been conditioned is to think architecture as a built form, right? Buildings, for example, walls that being set up, and there are certain conventional language that we use with architecture, right? But it is well established that early architecture was actually conceived or prefaced by rituals. It was rituals that became architecture later, right? So space was actually defined by a body that was a dancing body or a praying body that somehow or other conditioned how spaces were built. So this is one way to think about this, right? I'll just digress into the Christian tradition for a while. And there was a lot of debate in the Christian traditions whether even to build churches, because the body of Christ was simply thought of being the church, right? And the word church does not mean a building, it actually means a congregation. So that's one way to think about it. And the mosque cannot contain the number of worshippers. We spill out, right? So where is the building, right?
Interesting.
It keeps building up, and there's a whole fiqh on how does a congregant at the back connect to the imam in front when you don't see, right?
MashaAllah, yeah.
So that architecture is acoustic, right? Because you at least have to know how to follow, or you got to take visual clues, right? So if you think about this, then perhaps architecture, maybe I should have rephrased it. Maybe architecture should be taught beyond the convention of the 4 walls, the entrance and exits. Maybe architecture is also in the way space is occupied and formed. And hopefully in the next lecture, we'll talk about even how congregations are formed up, And today I spoke about how a space is defined for someone to stand up and pray, because actually there is an invisible wall. You are not supposed to cut through, right? So what is preventing someone from cutting through? Where is the entrance? Where is the exit? What is the perimeter I'm setting up? And this is what I'm trying to get to, that the notion of architecture may not necessarily be the materiality that we've been conditioned to, and it has got purposes that is beyond. It's similar to the way I spoke about function just now. If we continue to think about the needs of the human is of utility and efficiency, right? The way we build would be the ways perhaps we are building currently. But if you think beyond that, right, that man has a metaphysical dimension, man has other needs beyond the material world, and that becomes a project brief, right? That would translate to be a different type of architecture, right? So perhaps that's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, Dr. Faris, you mentioned on the theories or the ideas of material and the immaterial. Would you say that in the modern context, architecture has been kind of stripped away from, quote unquote, the spiritual or the immaterial? Is there any, now when they build buildings, has it shifted? Do you see any trends? Yep.
Done.
Do you see any trends, Faris? I think I just add in. I think it is a very valid question in terms of asking whether how have we moved, or what is the kind of progress are we making? What is, and then the next question we ask is what is the trade-off we've made? But then again, as I said, this is a dichotomy that we find ourselves in, because we keep looking at Islamic architecture or architectural Islam as a kind of remnant of the past, where there's a visual signal that we keep on harping on, rather than sort of like developing. And if you look at the examples that we have seen so far, and we're not even touching some of these names yet, right? Al-Farabi, for example, he worked on himself first, and to get onto that project, right? So I think architecture will always be there in whatever form, but more so, I think the trade-off is that, if it's kind of hard. It is more like, how do we move on from here to uncover this process of unveiling, and also this process of unraveling sacred spaces, and we start with ourselves. I think that is the first. Even more so, how do we actually could identify a sacred space is getting quite the challenge, in my opinion. That would be one exercise that we can sort of like we can count with our fingers, what are the sacred spaces here in our experience locally, at least.
I think my answer is, I'll say something quite general. I'm not very I don't want to be too critical of what architects are grappling with right now, and I also don't want to paint broad strokes. There's a lot of good work being produced within the constraints architects or developers find themselves in. It's just the network of things that control the way architecture now becomes a form, right? It's really different, as Zan was saying, to something in the 16th century, right? One simple thing, if I could give you an example, the speed with which we tear down and build did not exist even, say, 200 years ago. And buildings used to exist for hundreds of years. So a great architect may only build 3 projects. He'll probably die, right?
Wow.
And think about it, right? And so the investment and time to build any of this is a little bit different from how architecture is practiced now. So I also don't want to be too critical, and because the way faith, sacredness, and the things that controls our views of ourselves in the world is so heterogeneous, it's not very easy. And you must know, about 300 years ago, right, the primary buildings you would build all have sacred connotation. The palace, because the king or the queen is a kind of as a lineage, or the Khalifa, for example, right? So there's something sacred in the way you approach it. The mosque or the cathedral is the second significant building a country will invest in, and that is a direct lineage to it. And that's what we read in history anyway, right? But now the major buildings are not this. There's something else that are controlling our lives, and we just have to adapt and work around it. So there are real challenges. I think that the talk today perhaps is, and this is a continuing tradition, is can we have some small breakthroughs in the way we even view about what space is, how to even approach architecture using different lenses, that even within these challenges, maybe there could be a small moment in architecture where you can feel a little bit liberated from how you continually think about yourself in this world. Yeah.
Right. Okay, next one for Dr. Faris and Faizan, about the idea of, you mentioned about prayer and its connectedness with the cosmos and God towards the end of the lecture. Is there could you elaborate a little bit on the idea of a person making the prayer, for example, in Mecca or any sacred space, and then them going back home to their whichever country they're from? Is there the idea of them bringing that sacred space with them wherever they go? Is this something that was explored, or rather, was it discussed in the classical traditions, or? Or was it a case of, if I pray at Mecca, I'm just at Mecca. Or, if I'm at home, I'm at home. Is that the idea? Because we talk about architecture being fluid, or is it permanent? Yeah. So, yeah.
I've two quick answers for that. I think this connectivity where the sacred space of the haram, for example, always being part of you, I think that has got to do with your spiritual insight and quality that you hold, right? That means every time you stand up to pray, and there's a whole kind of reading about when you stand up to pray, the condition that you're in can be between standing at the bridge as you're going to cross in the final, the day of judgment, or it is really how you have developed your spiritual acumen, right? Yeah. The second part, I wish I brought the evidence here. There are texts and there are writings where people from where they are, and this was a person standing in Syria who's pointing to his son from the roof and saying he can see Mecca, and he sees it, right? And then somehow or other the veils has been opened and the space and time has collapsed. And there are some references to this. I don't know whether you'll cover it, and maybe we can explore or give some examples on this. Yeah. So there I think there's the hadith on Umar, right? Standing in the mimbar, and he was calling out to someone in the battlefield, or was reporting from someone from the battlefield. It was very accurate. So there are traditions where, in the Islamic tradition, right? For example, where space and time has collapsed, right? That is another way of looking into this, right? Where you are literally in that space. The third one that just came into my mind, the great awliyas have been found to be in several places, right? And someone had found them, doing a tawaf, right?
Mashallah.
So, and they were supposed to be back home, and like, what was happening there, right? So, and I really hope, I do not know who is listening to this, and those who want to carry on researches, this is what I'm saying. There's so many ways within our tradition we can think of architecture. Just a space-time collapse,
Mashallah.
right? Where we are not bounded by moving into the space, but the space is moving towards you because of your spiritual quality, right? You don't move, things move towards you. Stop.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think, inshallah, that would be the last question. But perhaps maybe Dr. Faris and Faizan, in order to scope the next few lessons, maybe you just want to have some concluding remarks about what the viewers can expect to see over the next few weeks. Yeah.
Should have done a trailer. So. Okay, on the last point, no, we cannot conclude without speaking about the Prophet's experience, right? And what I was just saying about space and time collapsing goes to the Isra Miraj. The Burak's step was as far as the eye could see, and the Prophet moved between heaven and earth, some say within, just like that, right? So that kind of lingers on the notion of space. What we would be covering, at least inshallah next week, would be on the geometry of prayer, right? So I kind of left it at the last point there, where the different postures actually allows us to understand some spatial geometries. And we will see how far that takes us, because if time allows us, we will also be covering congregation. I think Zan will help us cover that. And I think he'll bring another weight, because he is more well-versed in also contemporary geometries and formations. There could be another insight to this. So that is something we are hoping to cover. And over the last 2 weeks also, for myself, I perhaps would like to share some of my researches into thinkers I've introduced today, perhaps Al-Farabi and a little bit of Ibn Arabi as well. Yeah.
Mashallah.
Zan, you want to add on to this?
Yeah.
I know we have not. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Not really, but I think moving on to the kind of a setup of the lecture is that it is a very vast expense, and I think it is giving homage to the tradition itself, not particularly looking at just visible optical examples of architecture, but I think more towards the spirit of understanding. By understanding architecture, we will understand ourselves, and vice versa. I think that is
nicely
something
said.
until today. I think this is for myself and Dr. Faris. This is a long time coming, because it's something that we sort of like research and sort of like speak about and write about a lot, but we're never sharing the same platform to share. Yeah, even with you, Abu, and some of the questions here. I think it's amazing. Thank you so
Alhamdulillah.
much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I think that's a lot of very insightful gems that we can get from your talk. And to be honest, we are really looking forward to the next few weeks, because as you cover a lot of the issues like geometry of prayer and you about the thinkers that you mentioned, Dr. Faris. So yeah, there are a lot of questions that are still roaming in our heads, and inshallah we will cover them over the next few weeks. But thank you so much to Dr. Faris and Faizan. We look forward to continuing this series next week and the next few weeks, Wednesdays in July.
Yeah.
And with that, inshallah, we'll catch you again next week with more questions.
Inshallah. Yeah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. May Allah bless all of you.
Salam.
Ameen.
All right.
Ameen.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, we've come to the end of the lecture series for tonight on the history and theory of architectural Islam, the body, image, and spirit of place, with Dr. Faris, Hajamaideen, and also Faizan Shah. And we hope that, inshallah, it was beneficial for all of you. If you have any questions, you can send them to that number that we mentioned next week, right? And we hope that you continue and you share the posters so that more people can benefit, inshallah. A few announcements. One announcement is that we are still continuing our Korban efforts to look for those who are still interested, right? So the closing date is actually on the 16th of July. So those of you who are still interested to have your Korban rights being completed in Senegal, you can actually go to our link, bit.ly/Africa Korban. It's actually in the comments, bit.ly/Africa Korban, to find out more about the Korban in Senegal, West Africa. And do tune in to our social media platforms so that you can find out more about such talks. And we hope that, if there's anything that interests you or you find beneficial, we hope that you can spread the word, inshallah. And with that, please pray for us, our volunteers who are working behind the scenes to set this up, and also to our directors and our scholars and our teachers. May Allah bless all of them. Please forgive us for any shortcomings. And we hope you join us again next week, inshallah. And with that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh.